This brand was quite literally built because of the fires of World War II. And yet, despite being 80 years old, it's probably one of the best examples of maintaining your heritage since the Porsche 911. I'm talking about the story of Jeep. War has this tragic history of pushing technology farther than it ever has in terms of advancement and innovation, certainly in the realm of murder and killing people. And World War I was not just an exception, it was the benchmark, as it saw lots of innovations like strategic bombing, chemical warfare, tanks, and the proliferation of machine guns. But one invention and innovation that was not used strictly for killing people was the car. Now, the car was still very much early in development. It was less than 20 years old by this point when war broke out. And that led to some issues. Early cars and trucks simply were not good enough for the cratered moonscape that was the Western Front. Motorcycles worked, but they couldn't carry anything. So horses were still used in World War I throughout the entire conflict. But those trucks did still make an impression, and military planners began to realize the value of standardized truck classes in modern militaries. So let's fast forward to the mid-1930s, and the US military had created the following transport truck classes: half a ton, 1.5 ton, 2.5 ton, 4 ton, and 7.5 ton trucks. But as they watched the various Axis powers invade country after country, they realized that a more mobile vehicle was necessary: a 1/4 ton truck. And a small Pennsylvania company called American Bantam tested some cars with the Pennsylvania National Guard, and their tests got the attention of Army officer Robert Howe. So he organized Bantam and a committee of officers and civilian engineers to draw up desired specifications for a 1/4 ton truck to fill the Army's void. And their requirements were kind of insane. 4-wheel drive, a 2-speed gearbox, seating for 3, a windshield that folded down to just 36 inches tall for the overall height, a wheelbase of 75 inches or less, perfectly flat bodywork, a top speed of 50 miles an hour, a payload capacity of 600 pounds, and a maximum weight of just 1,200 pounds. Oh, and both the prototype and 75 production versions have to be ready in just 124 days. And you thought your boss was demanding. Now, in fairness, the Army did realize that some of those requirements were all but impossible, and increased the size and weight dimensions to ensure reliability on the battlefield. And the new truck was needed more than ever as Hitler's forces began knocking down European nations like dominoes. So an ex-Duesenberg engineer, Harold Christ, worked with Bantam to design their prototype, and in order to streamline development, they used off-the-shelf components from Studebaker and Austin. As in, they started working on the prototype on July 1940, and it was delivered before the end of September that same year. They started properly developing this thing in July, and it was ready by September. That is probably the most insane R&D cycle I've ever heard in my life. And the Army was very impressed. But there was one elephant in the room. Bantam did not have the means to produce it on any necessary scale. So with Hitler's army banging on Britain's door, the US damned exclusivity and opened Bantam's design to those who could produce it: Ford and Willis. The first production models rolled off the line November 1940, which again, just to reiterate, that's what, 4 months after they started development? I know I researched this, wrote it, am editing it, and speaking it, and I still can't get over that timetable. That's just stupid. But it was a pretty good product. 4-wheel drive, 600-pound payload, 2,100-pound maximum weight, and a 1.8-liter inline-4 making 45 horsepower. But remember, this was also produced by Willis and Ford, and despite technically being the same design, The other guys made several improvements on each of their respective assembly lines, and by July 1941, the Army was sick of having 3 different variations of the same vehicle and decided to standardize it based on whose design was the best. And Willis won because it was a bit cheaper and it had a 60 horsepower Go Devil 4-cylinder. And that meant nationwide production of the Willis quarter-ton truck began in October 1941, which was great timing, because less than 2 months later, America's boats were messed with at Pearl Harbor and war was declared. The official designation for the quarter-ton trucks was MB for Willis and GPW for Ford, but everybody called them Jeeps. Nobody's 100% sure where the name came from. Some say it's a homage to the Popeye character Eugene the Jeep, and some say it's a slurring of the official name GP. Wherever the name came from, it stuck, and the USO lexicon called four-wheel drive vehicles of 0.5-ton to 1.5-ton capacity for reconnaissance or other Army duties Jeeps by 1942. And the Jeep is one of the few vehicles to serve in every single theater of war in the hands of every single ally. With over 650,000 produced in 5 years, each U.S. Army regiment had around 145 Jeeps at their disposal. It got to the point that German soldiers thought Jeeps were provided to individual soldiers as part of their accompaniment. This and constant improvements led to Jeeps serving everywhere from the frozen winters of Russia to battling Rommel in the deserts of North Africa to landing on the beaches in the Pacific. Anywhere the Allies went, a Jeep was right there with them. The brilliance was their size and utilization of said size. The perfectly geometric body lines let it be used as tables, shooting platforms, and surgery beds. Its four-wheel drive system and general ruggedness allowed it to reach any front line quickly to deliver ammunition and evacuate the wounded. Even when it reached obstacles it couldn't cross, Jeeps were modified to cross them. There were railroad variants, swimming variants, tractor variants, and even one that learned how to fly. The rotobuggy was kind of unnecessary since heavyweight gliders were a thing, but they made a Jeep that could actually fall with style. It was the Swiss Army knife for the Zippo lighter of vehicles. To quote war journalist Ernie Pyle, it does everything, it goes everywhere, it's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for and still keeps going. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower called it one of the 5 pieces of equipment that won the war. Small wonder then that variations and evolutions of the Jeep were used in every US conflict until 1982 when it was replaced by the Humvee, which shares a lot of design cues with the Jeep. And just a little interesting side effect from all of this war development. I told you, technology tends to progress quite a bit in wartime. You could argue it was the fastest vehicle in America at that point. Think about it. Four-wheel drive, a manual gearbox, very light curb weight, supremely uncomfortable suspension, bucket seats, and a lot of horsepower from the time. It was practically a performance car. Enzo Ferrari, in fact, called it America's only real sports car, and GIs praised it as being a very fun vehicle to drive off-road, earning the nickname Leaping Lena. The wartime production of the Jeep did something more than just win the war. It proved that four-wheel drive vehicles could be mass-produced, and the fun that the GIs had behind the wheel when they weren't being shot at meant that they wanted to buy them when they got home. So Willis secured the trademark and built them for returning GIs as the Jeep Station Wagon, Pickup, and Jeepster. The early civilian Jeeps, or CJs, were just military vehicles with better lighting, chrome trim, and color options. They were mainly built for farmers and industrial work, so it took until the CJ5 in 1954 to design one for the average commercial driver. The CJ5 had comfier seats, power steering, and a 3.7-liter V6 making 155 horsepower, which quickly became the most popular model. When production ended in 1983, over 600,000 were sold. But the V6 wasn't the absolute fastest Jeep. See, AMC took the company over in 1970 and began installing their own engines, including the 5-liter naturally aspirated V8 making 150 horsepower and 250 foot-pounds of torque in a 2,700-pound vehicle with four-wheel drive. Yeah, that's some pretty impressive statistics even now in terms of power-to-weight ratio, especially with all-wheel drive. But more importantly than it's, let's be real, not all that impressive. It's still a Jeep after all, let's not get too excited. The CJ5 made it popular to own an off-road vehicle, and it led AMC to the CJ7 and its long wheelbase pickup variant, the CJ8. And the CJ7 began to show what modern Jeeps would become, and it was another smash hit, selling 380,000 models. But it wasn't enough for AMC, who sold a Jeep to Chrysler in 1987 as they went bust. And it was Chrysler who doubled down on Jeep's most forward-thinking model, the Wagoneer. First launched in 1964, it was a station wagon that could go off-road, also known as an SUV. And as the years went on, the first modern SUV became bigger and more comfortable. Sure, the Bronco and the International Scout were technically the first SUVs, but they were more off-road, farmer-focused. This was designed for families. And the off-roading nature slowly faded away as, well, those families went shopping for them, and they're not exactly going through the Amazonian rainforest to Kroger's. And these SUVs proved to be very high profit margin vehicles without needing a lot of upgrades. But Chrysler did want to keep it fresh from time to time and made the quality a little bit better each and every model year. And by the time the 90s rolled around, they even had keyless entry. The only thing that killed the Grand Wagoneer was, ironically, the very thing that led to Jeep being founded in the first place: war. A 1990 oil price shock caused by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait led to the sales of the gas-guzzling V8 SUV collapsing overnight, and Chrysler killed it off in less than a year. Luckily for them, Jeep had a well-established, recession-proof model in their arsenal, the Wrangler, which replaced the CJ lineup in 1986. It kept the iconic styling of the old wheelless MB, but with better safety features like anti-roll bars and a slightly lower ride height to keep it, right side up. And it had a roll cage, so that if it did fall over, you might not die. And it had anti-lock brakes and an automatic gearbox just to make it that little bit more livable. Why do you think they have sold 4 million Wranglers since their debut? And the Wrangler is an off-road SUV. These things are not as comfortable as normal SUVs. In fact, they're less aerodynamic than a cow. And that is a lot of sales for a relatively niche SUV. They are first and foremost off-road capable, and yet they still sell 200,000 per year. Now, I could go into the countless special editions with various paint options and off-road modifications, but I want to focus on 3 very special variants. In 2021, the gas-guzzling brick became eco-friendly with a hybrid version called the 4XZ. The hybrid system was paired to a 4-cylinder turbo to achieve 49 miles per gallon with 375 horsepower. And for being literally less aerodynamic than a cow, 49 mpg is fantastic. But if you pure-blooded Americans think that this is a Greenpeace sham, they got you covered. Because around the same time the 4XZ launched, a 6.4-liter Hemi-powered version came out with 470 horsepower and 470 torque. With the 33-inch off-road tires, it can do 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds and the quarter mile in 13 flat. I think of it like the old SVT Raptor as a high-powered V8 Baja-ready truck. But there was one better version that fit the Baja mold perfectly that sadly never went into production. The Jeep Trailcat concept was built for the annual Jeep Easter Safari in Moab, Utah. It is a no-expense-spared off-roading juggernaut. 40-inch crawler tires, Fox shocks, crawling spec Dana 60 axle, and since it was designed by SRT, you guessed it, they put a Hellcat engine in it to make 707 horsepower. I understand why they didn't build it for production, given, the insane danger of having people with 707 horsepower, essentially heavily modified Wrangler, but that doesn't stop me from feeling we're missing out. But Jeep would never be dumb enough to put the Hellcat engine in a Jeep again, right? Wrong! Their Grand Cherokee family SUV already had an SRT Hemi trim, so they just threw that old Hellcat engine in there anyway. But this wasn't for off-roading. The production model was designed for the street. The Jeep Trackhawk was designed to be the most SUV America had ever built. The most powerful SUV upon release? Check. A 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds? Check. A top speed of 180 miles an hour? A check. And unlike the Lamborghini Urus, which is more Audi, more Porsche, sensible German, the Trackhawk was a brutal, supercharged V8 assault on all of your senses. The lowered suspension and massive rims, which are necessary for these 6-piston Brembos, do not help the ride quality in the slightest. But it does mean that your family SUV with 707 horsepower can be driven without dying at the first corner. It was an impressive vehicle that stayed on the market until 2021 as FCA began winding down their V8 programs. Now currently Jeep has a wide range of SUVs, from the compact Liberty to the off-road Wrangler to the $110,000 Grand Wagoneer L. They also brought back their old pickup trucks with the Wrangler-based Gladiator. But the big news is their electric lineup. By 2025, the 4xe models will be doubled down upon, and their upcoming Recon is an EV designed for off-roading through nature without killing it. But for all you true die-hard Jeep fans, you're gonna have to accept that the Wrangler will be electric. They can't just get rid of it. It's the Porsche 911 of the Jeep lineup. So it is only a matter of time until America's favorite trailblazer goes all electric.